So our next speaker is Vazken Davidian, a doctoral candidate in the history of art, a very unique subject in our conference at Birkbeck University of London. His thesis is entitled "The Representation of the Figure of the Bantu, the Migrant Worker from Ottoman Armenia and Late 19th Century Constantinople Realism." Vazken's work and his interests include art history, late the Ottoman period, Ottoman Armenian art, and cultural history as well. And he is the editor of Towards Inclusive Art Histories, Ottoman Armenian Voices Speak Back, a special issue of the art history of the journal Études Arméniennes Contemporaines. Vazken will speak today about representing Plunder, Famine, and Destitution. This follows nicely on Özge's paper. The figure of the Beggar from Van in late 19th century Constantinople painting. Vazken.
Hello, everyone. I'm really, really happy to be here. Thank you so much to the Hrant Dink Foundation for organizing this brilliant conference. And I'm super excited to be following the wonderful Özge, because our work is really, really complementary. So we both deal with this sort of quite not very happy subject of famine, but hey, here you go. I'd like to start my presentation with the introduction of a brief excerpt from an article published on the 28th of May, 1882, in the influential Constantinople Armenian newspaper Masis. The second painting represents an Armenian beggar from Van, with his colorful rags and dark blue headdress, who, leaning upon his stick, looks at the viewer with pitiful eyes. The expression of this painting is extremely tender and heartrending. The sensitive brush of the author has succeeded in personifying the emigration and plundering, he uses the words Hığutyun and Hığutyun, of our provincial brethren. I saw foreigners who were saddened before this sight, and perhaps wasn't it natural that I should weep? I, who is not a connoisseur of the arts, he uses the word arvestaked, but simply, and he signs off, askaser. This short quote comprises the closing lines of the article painting exhibition, Negarahantes, reprinted soon after, on the 18th of July, 1882, in the newspaper Artsakank, Echo, published in Tiflis in Russian Georgia, raises a number of issues that require elaboration and unpicking. Only some of these will be dwelled upon in this presentation. The painting, Armenian Beggar from Van, to which the reviewer had responded with such heightened emotion, was a brushwork of the respected 19th century Constantinople artist Bedros Sarabian, 1833 to 1898, and is almost certainly the work currently listed as Poor Armenian Villager, Ahgad Hay Kuratsi, in the collection of the National Gallery of Armenia in Yerevan. And here's the painting. As described in the quote, Sarabian's painting represents a standing man dressed in pitiable rugs, with his hands resting upon a stick, his pleading eyes gazing imploringly at the viewer. The fatalistic acceptance of a miserable predicament is reflected in the pathetic expression of his face. The dark background precludes any detraction from the man's abject poverty or the artist's direct incitement for pity and empathy for his subject. This paper introduces Sarabian's Beggar, a painting that has recently also received the welcome consideration of the art historian Mary Roberts in her important 2015 book, Istanbul Exchanges, Ottomans, Orientalists, and 19th Century Visual Culture, alongside prominent Constantinople artist Simon Hagopyan's Beggar, Woman from Van. Hagopyan lived between 1857 and 1921, and he was a very important Istanbul artist. And he painted the Beggar Woman in Van in 1889. So this presentation treats them as important visual documents of urban artistic elites' intellectual engagement with the socioeconomic and political turmoil and catastrophic famines that characterize their perception of late 19th century Ottoman Armenia. Returning to the opening quote, its author, the self-confessed non-connoisseur of the arts, whose sole purpose had been the ascertainment of, and I quote, the position held by Armenian art at the prestigious 1882 exhibition of the Artists of the Bosphorus and Constantinople, the ABC Club, under the patronage of the British ambassador Lord Dufferin, was none other than the prominent Constantinople educator and writer-turned political activist Minas Cheraz, 1852-1928. Unable to delve into comprehensive details, I will only suffice to point out that Cheraz's adoption of the pseudonym Askaser, lover of nation, is a significant clue that represents social and political views held predominantly by liberal elites from a vantage point of Constantinople at a specific historical moment. I'll also hasten to add that the capitalization of the letters of the signature at the bottom, Askaser, merely conform to considerations of house style and therefore does not represent an additional sentimental outburst by its author. So all the author's names were capitalized. Before moving on, I would also like to draw attention to Cheraz's close connection to patriarchal circles. The reigning patriarch of Constantinople, Nerses Vazken 1837 to 1884, and he was patriarch between 1874 and 1884, who had been his former teacher at the Nubar Shahnazarian school in Hığutyun. And complicating matters further, the ex-patriarch Măgărici Hrimian, 1820-1907, he was patriarch between 1869 to 1873, known affectionately as Hairig, Little Father, a native of Van, and at that time the primate of Vaskuragan, whom he had served as secretary and translator as member of the Patriarchate's delegation to the European powers and the Congress of Berlin in the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878. The figure of the beggar was a commonplace sight on the streets of the Ottoman capital, had inevitably captured the attention of the 19th century artistic gaze, and several examples by local as well as foreign artists visiting or living in Constantinople survive. That the social phenomenon of begging was viewed as a major problem throughout the 1880s and 1890s can be attested by the presence of numerous reports and articles in the city's multilingual press. Most of these make reference neither to Van nor Ottoman Armenians, but ought to be viewed either as engagements with the widespread occurrence of begging in the city, or more commonly, especially in the visual arts, renderings produced with an art-buying public of a certain ethnographic sensibility in mind, where images of street types, especially exotic ones in timeless oriental settings, had become popular subjects for consumption. Consider in passing the following examples by two graduates of the city's Imperial Fine Arts School, the above-mentioned Simon Hığutyun, and the native of Trabzon, Arshak Fetvagyan, 1866 to 1947. These are just two examples of numerous paintings of beggars in Constantinople, in the streets of Constantinople. With the art market central to their production, works such as these were not always favored by art buyers. There are, for example, recorded instances of visiting Western artists being discouraged by their agents back home from sending paintings of beggars, being advised instead to concentrate on depictions of horses and camels. So the art buying public preferred horses and camels. Yet the presence of beggars in the city was also clearly perceived as an Ottoman Armenian problem. The Constantinople-born artist and art historian Raphael Shishmanyan, 1885-1859, noted that in the 1870s, desperate migrants, Bantukhts, from Ottoman Armenia, dressed in rags and in wretched conditions, unable to find work in the city, would wander the streets of Armenian-populated districts begging, often attacked, abused, or chased away by stone throwers, who were often children as well. He drew a direct link between the phenomena of Hığutyun, meaning the emigration of thousands of mostly men from Ottoman Armenia, many from the villages of Van and Mush, who migrated to Constantinople in search of a livelihood, where they often worked as hamals, porters, and the figure of the beggar. And anyone who knows me will know that I would never make a presentation without mentioning the hamals. These threads are woven into and come together in Sarabian's Armenian beggar from Van, and here he is again. And Cheraz's emotional response to it. Furthermore, from a vantage point of urban Constantinople in 1882, the perceived characteristics of primarily rural Ottoman Armenia, economic stagnation, destitution, physical insecurity, misrule, plunder, and social disorder, provide a stark context to the image and the text. At a time when the phenomenon of Hığutyun was viewed to have reached catastrophic proportions, the Bantukhts personified the economic wretchedness and misery of Ottoman Armenia on the streets, and the Huns, the slums of the imperial capital. Their plight in the city had become a central preoccupation for many Constantinople Armenian intellectuals, especially those of a socially reformist mindset, whilst the widespread poverty in Ottoman Armenia was an ever-present feature on the pages of the city's Armenian press. Consider, for example, Hrant's, it's a pseudonym of Melkon Gürcan, 1859 to 1915, his series of chronicles, Letters of the Bantuchtina Magner, published in masses between 1889 and 1892. This is just an example, an important example, but just an example. In literature and the visual arts, Hığutyun was most prominently associated with the figure of the migrant Hamal from Mush, with Mush acting as the popular metonymic signifier and personification for an economically depressed and plundered Ottoman Armenia. Consider, for example, again in passing, Simon Hagopian's especially poignant, deeply psychological portrait of a Bantucht Hamal from Mush. It's a wonderful painting. I think it's probably one of his masterpieces. The situation in Ottoman Armenia, the wartime destruction, the dashing of expectations for reform at the Treaty of Berlin provides a compelling background to paintings such as Hagopian's Hamal and Surabian's Beggar, and contemporary responses engendered. This is clearly seen in Cheraz's emotional text on Surabian's painting. He was, after all, intimately familiar with the content of the petitions from Ottoman Armenia that flooded the Patriarchate throughout the 1870s into the 1880s, detailing misrule and plunder exacted by Kurdish tribes. Surabian's reference to Van, meanwhile, further adds the post-war famine of 1879-1881 to the above, making it explicit in his conception and execution of the painting. The historian, the wonderful historian Özge Erdem, has already considered this specific famine and the ensuing relief effort in her 2012 doctoral thesis, Eating the Last Seed, Famine, Empire, Survival and Order in Ottoman Anatolia. Referred to in contemporary Armenian sources as the Great Famine of Armenia or the Famine of Van, this man-made disaster had received extensive coverage by the Ottoman international media. Consider, for example, again in passing because we don't have time, the following full-page visual representations of the famine on the front cover of the 22nd of May 1880 edition of the French journal Le Monde Illustré, depicting a group of starving people from Van, or the full-page series of illustrations also showing a group of starving peasants from Van, published in the British journal The Graphic on the 10th of July 1880, captioned The Famine in Armenia, Sketches from Diyarbakir. And the Vanetsis are the little image over there. Apparently the committee for relief actually sent them a photograph and they produced the etching from the photograph. A quick glance at the Ottoman Armenian press reveals the extensive, often daily coverage of the famine and its relief as late as 1886. I don't want to replicate what you said, but I'll just really briefly mention, for example, on the 15th of March 1886, the influential Constantinople newspaper Arevelk, Orient, published all 56 articles of the lengthy 1885 report of the Central Caretaker Committee for the Famine-Stricken, on its front page, summarizing and listing the activities of the committee, including its 233 meetings between 1880 and 1884, the types of aid, material and financial, and its accomplishments. Much emphasis was placed on the region of Van Vaspuragan, where relief was overseen by Hrimian Hayrik himself. The complete report, edited between 22nd of April and 9th of September 1884 by Archbishop Marakia Ormanyan, 1841 to 1918, and he was patriarch between 1896 to 1908, revealing the unprecedented scale of humanitarian efforts in Constantinople and as far as America, India, Java, and elsewhere, and including the names of all donors, was published as a separate volume, and Özge discussed that earlier. Writing of the immediate aftermath of the war and the catastrophic famine in his 3-volume magnum opus Askabadum, History of the Armenian Church, published in Istanbul in 1912, Ormanyan, a leading actor in the relief effort, noted the committee established to organize aid to Ottoman Armenia had also provided agricultural means, prepared agricultural planning, encouraged the development of various crafts, and facilitated the work of cultivators by providing them with animals and equipment on a loan basis, so as not to encourage handouts that had not resulted from toil to serve towards dangerous sluggishness, and lowly beggary, muratzik stornutyun. Ormanyan particularly highlighted the establishment of a new agricultural school at Varak, discussed by Özge, as well as schools in locations such as Van and Ahbak, again discussed by Özge. The post-famine organization and reform of the agricultural sector and engagement in the education of promising youths from all religious groups towards the development of Ottoman Armenia was widely praised. Despite the increasingly tightening censorship of the Abdülhamid II period regime, news of the famine and relief efforts were widely presented to the reading public and provide a compelling backdrop to Sarabian's Beggar. Meanwhile, the duties of the Committee for Inspection and Controls, responsible for the approval of all publications, also included the scrutiny of pictures. Mary Roberts rightly points out that the authorities would not have viewed Sarabian's Beggar as a critique of the Ottoman state, but instead as a harmless ethnographic representation, thus permitting its uncensored exhibition. There were some paintings that were actually removed from the exhibition because the censor sort of viewed them as pretty dangerous. Yet it is conceivable that the censor, even if making a connection between the painting and the recent much-reported famine, might still not have considered its message subversive. What remains certain is that Sarabian's Beggar had successfully bypassed any censorial constraints, and under a cloak of seemingly benign ethnographic naturalism, and through the use of allegory, had conveyed to the contemporary viewer, Minash Cheraz, a troubling underlying message on the complex situation in Ottoman Armenia, thus conjuring with a brush what the pen might not have been allowed to express. In her reading of Sarabian's Beggar and the critic's response, Roberts prefers a solely narrow political interpretation, thereby ignoring the socio-economic environment and especially the centrality of the famine in Ottoman Armenia in the conception or reception of the painting. Yet the naming of Van clearly signifies the 1879-1881 famine looming large on Sarabian's and Cheraz's consciousness. To Cheraz, the painting represented the personification of plunder and destitution, but also, crucially from a vantage point of 1882, famine, a subtle allegory on the inability of Ottoman Armenia to feed itself. Apart from Cheraz's response, I have yet to unearth other contemporary Ottoman Armenian responses to Sarabian's Armenian Beggar from Van. Yet on the 28th of June 1890, in a letter published in the Tiflis newspaper Mashag, the godfather of Western Armenian realism, the influential reformist writer and editor Arpiyar Arpiyaryan, 1851-1908, writing under the pseudonym Haygag, lamented that a similar painting by Sarabian of another Bantucht, Manuk Akhbar, that he had much praised in 1884, had been dismissed by the public due to the perceived ugliness of the subject's face, resulting in the abandonment by Sarabian of the Bantucht as subject. This was unsurprising, noted Arpiyaryan bitterly, as, and I quote, Constantinople Armenians lack the sophistication of feeling and empathizing with the beauty of the abject. Of course, that's not true today, is it? However, as late as 1889, artists were still engaging with the figure of the beggar from Van. Simon Hagopian's two surviving versions of the beggar woman from Van suggest that not everyone viewed such images with disdain, and this is one version of the painting, and it is in Istanbul. It's in a private collection today. Whether these paintings were ever displayed in public or reviewed, I have yet to establish. In this version of the painting, Hagopian utilizes a gritty naturalism and powerful realist visual vocabulary to elicit the empathetic response of the viewer towards the poor and dispossessed rural population of Ottoman Armenia 2 years after another famine in 1887, and the Bantuchts on the street of the imperial capital. As in Sarabian's Beggar, nothing detracts from the desperation and poverty of the old woman. Her bare feet and outstretched hands, her fingernails inked in black ink, you can sort of clearly see those, evoke the imploring fatalism of the posture and pathetic gaze of Sarabian's male beggar. The beggar woman's gender and old age add further layers to her destitution, loneliness, defenselessness, and cruel abandonment in a patriarchal society. Hagopian's background especially recalls the practice of late 19th century photographic studios of subjects being photographed outdoors with a blank canvas on the wall with its cracks serving to reinforce an aura of hopelessness, heightening the realism of the scene. In closing, Sarabian's Armenian Beggar from Van and Hagopian's Beggar Woman from Van, painted in 1882 and 1889 respectively, were conceived during a decade of complex ideological transformations in the relationship of the Ottoman state and Ottoman Armenians. During this period that separates them, much had changed. The situation in Ottoman Armenia had deteriorated significantly. culture had become increasingly politicized, with the state perceiving or presenting any manifestation of Armenian identity as a threat. The already strict censorship regime had become tighter, and even the mention of Armenia suppressed. In 1889, it seems unthinkable for the censor to have allowed the publication of Cheraz's strongly worded response to Srabian's Beggar. Meanwhile, the absence of the word Armenian from the title of Hığutyun's painting, despite the obvious identity of the subject being apparent to all contemporaries, serves as further food for thought. This paper has proposed that in these representations of beggars, the work of two important artists associated with the late 19th century urban liberal milieu of Constantinople, the naming of Van was designed to draw attention to famine, most notably that of 1879-1881, alongside the widespread plunder and destitution in Ottoman Armenia. Just as the more common figure of the Bantoht Hamal from Mush, the beggar from Van personified Ottoman Armenia, imbuing the paintings with allegorical meaning and a powerful message that often successfully evaded the censor's scalpel. Thank you very much. Thank you.